to these guys, and we didn't know it.
So they had no idea that the SPLC was using informants and providing information to the government. 5 days later, Mr. Blanche was forced to acknowledge that that was a false statement. In fact, it was in a document filed by the Department of Justice where he said it is true, he went on TV and said it is true that over the years they have selectively shared information with law enforcement. That's well documented and no dispute, but they aren't charged with any of that conduct. What the hell does that mean, they aren't charged with any of that conduct? The entire premise of this fraud scheme is that SPLC was actually using the money given by the donors to support the hate groups, not to dismantle them as they represented. So any knowledge by the government that the SPLC shared information with them to dismantle these groups completely undermines and defeats the fraud claim. But there's plenty of evidence that the FBI knew that the information provided to them by the SPLC to help the FBI dismantle these groups came from informants. In fact, 2 weeks before the indictment, the SPLC presented the U.S. Attorney's Office with evidence that showed that they had been sharing information from informants with the FBI dating back to 2018. And even Blanche's statement that none of the information shared with the FBI was charged in the indictment is false. It doesn't matter because that's not what the fraud claim is, but it is false because the Charlottesville Unite the Right movement is specifically mentioned in the indictment, but the indictment does not mention the 45-page report that the SPLC sent to multiple FBI offices before the Unite the Right event that included information from their informants. Now, we've established that. Now we know this fraud claim is completely bogus, but it gets worse because it's not even part of the allegations. In paragraph 19 of the indictment, it explains the fraud scheme. It says that the SPLC represented to the victim donors that their money would be used to help dismantle violent extremist groups, but that they did not tell those donors exactly how they would do that. So it actually charges fraud by omission, not misrepresentation. But in order to have fraud by omission, you must prove that the omission was material to the victims such that they would have acted differently if they had known about it. But there isn't a single allegation in the indictment that any donor would not have donated if they knew about the payments to informants. In fact, everything we know is the opposite. Ms. Wiley has pointed out repeatedly about how donors are trying to continue to give. And that Intercept article that Ranking Member Raskin introduced cites 20 donors who now say that they either knew about the paid informants or they would have made their donations anyway. And so what is this really about? It is weaponizing and politicizing the Department of Justice, not any of your groups, to quash and squash free speech, to muzzle people that because you are trying to protect far-right investigations who are huge supporters of the Republican Party. They may not do any oversight over this indictment, but I guarantee you when we take the majority back in January, we will be doing that oversight and they will be held accountable.
The story centers on a major move by the Department of Justice in April 2026. Federal prosecutors charged the SPLC with multiple counts, including wire fraud, false statements, and conspiracy to commit money laundering. Reports indicate the allegations involve more than $3 million in donor funds directed toward individuals connected to various extremist organizations over nearly a decade. According to the indictment, the group had portrayed its work as focused on dismantling these groups, yet some payments reportedly went to sources inside them instead. This revelation sent shockwaves through advocacy circles and conservative commentators alike, raising questions about transparency and how nonprofits handle contributions. What caught many off guard was the timing and the statements that followed the announcement. Acting Attorney General Todd Blanche addressed the public shortly after the charges became known. He emphasized that the organization was not simply opposing extremism, but appeared to be entangled in ways that blurred those lines. Yet within days, additional filings seemed to adjust parts of that narrative. Goldman seized on this shift during the hearing, pointing out what he described as inconsistencies that undermine the entire foundation of the case. He referenced how the SPLC had shared select information with law enforcement over the years, including details tied to events like the 2017 Charlottesville gathering. Critics of the indictment argue this cooperation should have been factored in more heavily from the start. Goldman pressed further, highlighting a key element in the charging documents. The case appears built partly around omissions, suggesting donors were not fully informed about certain operational methods. However, proving that kind of fraud requires showing those details would have changed donor behavior in a meaningful way. From what has surfaced so far, there is little in the public record indicating widespread regret among supporters. In fact, accounts from various outlets note that some contributors have come forward saying they were aware of standard intelligence practices or would have continued giving regardless. This point became central in Goldman's remarks, as he questioned whether the charges truly reflect harm to victims or something else entirely. The congressman also brought up broader principles at play. He reminded colleagues of strong support for the First Amendment, even when it involves criticism of groups across the spectrum. The SPLC, known for its hate monitoring efforts and legal work against discrimination, has long drawn both praise for shining light on threats and criticism for how it categorizes certain organizations. Some view its influential hate map as a vital public service, while others claim it casts too wide a net, sometimes including mainstream voices. This indictment has amplified those existing tensions, with discussions swirling about whether the action represents accountability or an attempt to chill legitimate advocacy. Reports suggest the SPLC has pushed back vigorously, filing motions that describe the prosecution as selective and politically motivated. Delving into the background reveals a pattern of high-stakes operations. The SPLC's use of informants is not entirely new in the world of monitoring extremism. Similar techniques appear in law enforcement and investigative journalism. Yet the scale of payments alleged here, millions funneled through various channels, has fueled speculation about oversight and internal decision-making. Supporters maintain these methods helped gather critical intelligence that benefited public safety, pointing to documented instances where information reached authorities. Detractors, including some in the current administration, counter that the approach may have inadvertently sustained the very dynamics it claimed to combat. Online forums and commentary sections are filled with competing theories, from claims of inflated threats for fundraising purposes to accusations of retaliatory targeting under shifting political leadership. One particularly scrutinized aspect involves communications between the SPLC and federal agencies. Goldman referenced materials presented to prosecutors showing years of selective sharing, including a detailed report ahead of the Unite the Right rally. The indictment mentions the event, but, according to the defense arguments, does not fully address how prior cooperation factored into the alleged scheme. This discrepancy has led analysts to debate whether the fraud premise holds up when government entities had some visibility into the practices. Blanche's team later acknowledged aspects of the sharing in follow-up statements, which Goldman described as a notable reversal that weakens confidence in the original public messaging. Beyond the courtroom technicalities, the case touches on larger questions about donor trust and organizational accountability. Nonprofits like the SPLC rely heavily on public contributions, often framing their missions around urgent social issues. When questions arise about fund allocation, it can erode confidence across the board. Yet emerging details from interviews and articles show a resilient base of support. Several donors reportedly reaffirmed their commitment, viewing the payments as part of effective, if unconventional, strategies against real dangers. This resilience has prompted observers to wonder if the controversy will ultimately strengthen or weaken the organization's position in the long run. The political dimensions add another layer of intensity. With Republicans controlling key positions in the executive branch, some Democrats, including Goldman, have framed the indictment as part of a pattern aimed at groups perceived as opposing certain viewpoints. They point to broader policy shifts that appear to de-emphasize certain types of extremism monitoring. On the other side, proponents of the charges argue it is simply enforcing basic rules against misleading donors, regardless of the cause. This divide mirrors wider societal debates about balance, bias, and the role of government in overseeing influential nonprofits. Speculation continues about potential future oversight hearings, especially as power dynamics in Congress could shift again. Adding to the intrigue are ongoing discussions about the SPLC's overall track record. The group has faced internal challenges and external critiques in recent years, from questions about its financial scale to debates over specific designations. While these elements predate the current indictment, they provide context for why the case resonates so strongly. Rumors and online chatter have intensified, with some voices suggesting the organization prioritized visibility and revenue over pure impact, while defenders highlight successful lawsuits and educational programs that have made tangible differences. Neutral observers note that the truth likely involves a mix of dedication and the complexities of operating in a polarized environment. As the legal proceedings move forward, several unknowns remain. Will additional evidence emerge that clarifies the informant relationships and their outcomes? How might courts view the materiality of any omissions in donor communications? And what precedent could this set for other advocacy organizations navigating similar terrain? Goldman closed his remarks by signaling strong intent for congressional review once opportunities arise, underscoring the stakes involved. The hearing itself showcased the passionate arguments on both sides, reflecting a nation grappling with how best to address division and extremism without compromising fundamental freedoms. This situation invites everyone to consider the delicate balance between vigilance against real threats and ensuring institutions remain transparent and accountable. Whether one views the SPLC primarily as a defender against hate or as an entity that sometimes overreaches, the indictment has forced a public reckoning. It highlights how quickly narratives can shift when high-profile actions meet detailed pushback. Many are watching closely to see what comes next in the courtroom and in the court of public opinion. The reactions to Goldman's delivery spread rapidly online, with clips circulating among those interested in civil liberties, nonprofit governance, and political accountability. Some praised the detailed breakdown and focus on inconsistencies, seeing it as a necessary check on executive power. Others expressed skepticism, arguing that any organization handling millions of donations should expect rigorous examination, especially amid claims of deceptive practices. This split in responses mirrors the broader polarization surrounding the SPLC for years. Further reports have surfaced about the practical effects on the ground. The organization reportedly adjusted certain programs following the scrutiny, while continuing its core monitoring work. Donors and supporters have organized in response, emphasizing the importance of independent voices in tracking societal issues. Meanwhile, law enforcement ties and intelligence sharing practices across similar groups have come under renewed discussion, with questions about best practices for balancing secrecy and oversight. Experts following the case point out that fraud prosecutions in the nonprofit sector are relatively uncommon, but carry significant weight when they proceed. Success for the government would require demonstrating clear intent to mislead and resulting harm. The absence of widespread donor withdrawal, as noted in various accounts, could prove challenging for that element. At the same time, the scale of alleged payments provides prosecutors with concrete figures to build around. This tension between the financial details and the contextual defenses keeps the conversation lively and multifaceted. Looking ahead, the implications extend beyond one organization. If the charges stick, it might encourage more aggressive reviews of how other groups describe their methods to supporters. If the case falters or gets narrowed significantly, It could reinforce arguments about selective enforcement in politically charged times. Either outcome will likely fuel more debate on the boundaries of protected speech and the government's role in regulating charitable activities. Goldman and his colleagues have positioned themselves as watchdogs against potential abuse, promising thorough examination in future sessions. Throughout this unfolding story, one theme persists: the need for clarity and honesty in how public interest groups operate. Americans value robust debate and strong advocacy, but they also expect organizations to align actions with stated missions. The SPLC indictment, with its mix of serious allegations, procedural questions, and partisan reactions, serves as a compelling case study in